My name is Thalia Waring, and I was 30 years old the first time a court had to decide whether I was a person. I was standing in my own office with coffee I hadn't touched when a man in a polo shirt handed me a folded citation and said my mother and father had filed it that morning. I manage money for people who can't manage their own, licensed by this state, appointed by this court, audited every year. The paper in my hand asked that same court to hand my bank account, my car, and the apartment I paid for myself over to my parents, because I was, in their words, too irresponsible to manage an inheritance. I signed for it. I said thank you, then I went back and finished my 1 o'clock. Because a family in the next room was waiting to hear how their brother's money worked, but what their lawyer read out loud in that courtroom, 11 weeks later, is the part I still can't explain. And what I did after the judge stood up cost me more than the petition ever could have. Before I tell you what happened next, please hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from now. Let me take you back to 9 years ago, when a woman who fed other people's children for 31 years said something to me I didn't understand until this year. The smell of Northgate Meadows never changed, coffee and floor wax and something underneath that was just age and warm laundry. I signed the clipboard by the coffee machine every Thursday at 4. Pen tied on with a shoelace, and I wrote the same word in the third column so many times my hand did it without me. Then I walked to room 214, where Delphine Rask sat, 84. Hands folded like she was still counting trays for a cafeteria that closed years ago. She had no children of her own. So the court called me a licensed professional fiduciary, which means a judge signs an order, and after that I'm the one paying the bills, arguing with the insurance company, showing up when nobody else will. 19 files in a green accordion folder. 19 people who list my name as their emergency contact. My own dentist's intake form has the name of the office 2 doors down under mine. Because I couldn't think of anyone else to write there, I didn't find that sad back then. I found it efficient. My mother worked the county intake line for 31 years, deciding whose call got a file opened and who's got a phone number, and a good luck, she used to sit at her kitchen table with colored paper clips, blue for the current matter, red for anything with a deadline, and she'd say to me, everybody thinks the system is cruel until the day they need it to move fast for them. I didn't understand that sentence for years. My father fixed school buses for 30 years. Quiet hands. Quiet house, the kind of man who says grace like it's a chore checklist. Sunday dinners at their place smelled like a roast and cut grass through a cracked window. And my mother always refilled my glass before I asked. When my grandmother died in March, 88, in her recliner with the television on the way she wanted it. The estate closed by June, $186,000 from an account she opened in 1979 and barely touched. My father got a set of tools and a photograph. My mother got nothing, and my mother noticed that Sunday. Over the roast, my mother asked what I was going to do with the money, not what I wanted. What I was going to do, I said I'd leave it where it was. She said your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly at the end. I told her grandma beat me at cards in February. She said people can hold a hand of cards and still not know what they're doing. Then asked if I wanted more carrots, in the exact same voice she used for the weather. I've replayed that sentence 100 times since. She wasn't talking about my grandmother. She was reading me a line she'd been rehearsing for 31 years. A few nights later, I came back early from a client meeting and stood outside their kitchen window because I'd left something in the driveway. And I heard my mother on the phone saying the words guardianship and inheritance and Thalia's not built for this kind of money the way some people are, in the flattened voice she used for case files. Not for family. I didn't knock. I stood there in the cold and listened to my own mother describe me the way you describe a stranger's paperwork. That's the word they use for everything that used to be love. Case. I went home that night and did not sleep. I didn't confront her. I didn't call my father. I went into my office the next morning and quietly moved the personal files I kept there. My will, my grandmother's letters, Into the one place in my life nobody else had a key to, I told myself. It was not nothing 3 weeks after that phone call. I was going through my grandmother's old cedar chest, the one my mother hadn't gotten around to claiming yet, looking for a photograph for the memorial folder. And I found an envelope taped to the underside of the lid with my name on it in her handwriting. Inside was a letter, dated 4 years earlier, and a business card for a man named Solomon Reyes, estate attorney, with a note in the margin that said call him first, before anyone else. He already knows. I sat on the floor of that garage for a long time. The letter said she'd watched my mother circle money her whole life, the way a bird circles water it can't land on, and that she wasn't leaving anything to chance with me. She'd already set up protections around the account years before she died, naming me sole and irrevocable beneficiary with language specifically barring any guardianship proceeding from reaching it. Language her own lawyer had drafted with exactly this family in mind. I called Solomon Reyes the next morning. He didn't sound surprised to hear from me. He said your grandmother came to me 9 years ago and said, quote, if my daughter ever tries what I think she'll try, I want the door already locked. He told me the guardianship petition, when it came, wouldn't touch a cent of that inheritance. She'd built it that way on purpose. 2 nights later, I drove past my parents' house on my way home and saw my mother's car still in the driveway at 11. Kitchen light on. And I knew somewhere in that house, she was finishing paperwork she thought would end with my name signed away. I texted Solomon 2 words, ready now. Solomon laid it out for me plainly, the way you'd explain a diagram to someone who needed to actually understand it, not just nod along. He said, in this state, once a guardianship petition is filed, the court appoints me independent counsel, someone whose entire job is to represent what I want, not what my parents want. He said, we would use the discovery process to force disclosure of exactly what accounts they'd listed and why. And that if I could show the court my own 7 years of licensed, bonded, audited work, plus my grandmother's own sworn letter about her intentions, the temporary freeze would very likely dissolve at the first real hearing. A week before that hearing, my mother called and asked me to come for dinner, said she missed me, said none of this had to be ugly, said if I just signed a small management agreement giving her oversight of the trust, she'd withdraw the whole petition that same week. I said I'll think about it. She smiled like she'd already won. My younger cousin, 26, called me that same night, said she didn't understand what was happening, but she'd heard my mother on the phone with a lawyer, and it scared her. And something about hearing that fear in a 26-year-old voice cracked something loose in my chest that the paperwork never had. I drove out to my grandmother's old place that weekend, sat on the same porch swing she used to sit on shelling peas, and let myself feel it, not rage, just grief. That a woman who raised me could look at 30 years of my own life and decide it needed her signature to be valid. I wish this were different. I wish my mother had been the kind of parent who called to ask how I was doing instead of what I was doing with the money. I wish she had needed nothing from me but my company. But wishes don't hold up in a courtroom. The letter my grandmother left me does. 11:50 at night. 3 days before the hearing, I sat alone at my kitchen table with one lamp on, and my laptop open to a video call with Solomon, going line by line through the sworn declaration we'd file at 9 a.m. He walked me through each exhibit, the letter, the attorney's own notes from 9 years back, my licensing records, my bond. 7 years of accountings that had never once come up short $1. At 12:03, I signed the declaration electronically, watched the little confirmation window close, and sat there in the quiet. I am 30, I am a licensed fiduciary, and I had just signed the document that would end this. Solomon said, we've got this, get some sleep. And then he was gone, and it was just the lamp and the hum of the refrigerator across town. I knew my mother was asleep, believing a guardianship hearing would hand her the keys to a fortune her own mother had locked away from her 9 years. Before she ever thought to try, she'll find that out in about 60 hours. The hearing landed on a Thursday. My mother wore the navy blazer she wore to funerals. My father sat beside her studying his own hands, Solomon stood and read the declaration into the record. Then read my grandmother's letter. Then read Solomon Ray's own notes, describing a woman who 9 years earlier had walked into his office and said almost word for word what her daughter would eventually do. The room went very still. The judge asked my mother's attorney if the petitioners had been aware of the irrevocable beneficiary provisions. Before filing, her attorney said no. My mother's face did the thing faces do when the floor moves and the person refuses to show it. She looked at me like I was still the woman they thought I was. I wasn't, I hadn't been for weeks. The judge dismissed the petition, ordered the freeze lifted same day, and noted for the record that the court found no evidence supporting the grounds alleged. My mother did not speak to me on the way out of that courtroom. My father caught up with me in the hallway, folded his hands the way he does, and said, "Your grandmother always did play the long game, didn't she?" It was the closest thing to an apology I ever got from him, and I took it. My mother used to say, "Everybody thinks the system is cruel until the day they need it to move fast for them." I used to think she meant sympathy for the families I served. She meant something else. She meant she understood exactly how fast a system could move against someone who had no one watching their back. My grandmother made sure I did. My mother never filed anything against me again. And we speak maybe twice a year now. Careful and short. My father still fixes what he can around the house, and every time I stop by he asks if I've eaten, and never asks about the money. Reba, who keeps my books, still brings her own tea bags on Tuesdays and never once brought up that spring again, though I know she remembers every week of it. As for me, I still carry the green accordion folder home every night, still sign that clipboard every Thursday at 4, and I think about my grandmother every time I write that third column. I think, some people build you a house. She built me a lock. If you've ever had someone in your own family decide they knew your life better than you did, I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments, and if this story moved you, subscribe to Dad's Revenge Tales. There are more to come.